Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The first piece of news comes from Australia, where DNA testing of what was thought to be a stray dog has proven itself to be an endangered species of the native dog known as a dingo. This adorable pup was found in a backyard in Australia, crying and seemingly in pain. It was then taken to a veterinarian, who then passed it on to the Australian Dingo Foundation. They tested it to identify how pure its bloodline was. Not only did they identify that this dingo was pure-blooded, but that it came from the particular subspecies of the Australian alpine dingo, which are an endangered species. Australian dingoes, or the native dog, are effectively rare in any of the wild environments because they are anywhere between 40 and 80% interbred with the more standard domestic dog. It is one of 3 dingo species in Australia, which include the inland dingo, which is most well known, the tropical, and finally the relevant species here, alpine dingoes. The last one are the only ones in danger of extinction. The interesting thing here is how the dingo was found. It is thought, from the marks on its back, that the young pup had been picked up by an eagle, carried away, and then eventually dropped. Fortunately for this young pup, he may well be put into the breeding program for the alpine dingoes, which is both a good end for him and a boon to the program itself. In horrifying news coming out of the former Soviet bloc, an ant colony found in a Soviet nuclear bunker has been surviving through cannibalism. In 2010, volunteers started going into a former bunker that held nuclear ammunition. Their role was to monitor the bat population over winter. They also found a rather large ant nest. This ant nest had no queen or any of the usual formations and mechanisms for a colony to survive. 3 years later, the colony was found to have about 1 million workers and several more million that were dead. The ant colony was not being replenished through reproduction. This couldn't be possible without a queen. And the question became, how was it surviving? The researchers have identified that there is a small pipe going up to the surface of ventilation. Directly above this pipe on the surface is a fully functional ant nest that, on occasion, will be dropping workers down into the bunker, where they help to replenish the ants that are living there. In total darkness, without any light or food source, the question then became, how are they surviving? Obviously, the first thought was cannibalism, but they didn't know to what degree, or even if it were true. They were able to figure this out by finding what are effectively mass graves, and they took away a large number of ant bodies to be investigated. They found that over 90% had been eaten into by their comrades. In a twist of good fortune and human intervention, the same researchers that described this also installed a wooden plank going back up to that pipe from which the ants fall, and it allows them to return to the nest and surface and no longer need to cannibalize their comrades. In an interesting outcome to an otherwise mundane investigation, researchers have identified a number of women that lack a physical structure in their nose that should have allowed them to smell, but who can still experience the sensation of scent. Over 1,000 brain scans were conducted, and they found that there were several women in this cohort that could identify smells even though they did not have an olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb is supposed to be the location where scents will bind to. It will then activate a nerve that travels to the brain and tell the brain, this is what you are smelling right now. It has long been held that without this structure, your brain cannot communicate with the nose and understand what it is experiencing. The first two participants came out of a completely unrelated study looking at left-handedness and the ability to smell. The other three people found without an olfactory bulb were identified through a large collection of MRIs that were part of a public data collection. This allowed them to both verify their original findings in two participants and demonstrate it in a larger sampling. They were then able to go back to their two original participants and find a third with an unrelated condition that should have also led to no sense of smell, and demonstrate that they could indeed smell something, understand what it was, and then describe it to the researchers. Next is a nightmare-inducing case study. A publication came out recently describing how a woman had been infected by a parasite called Thalasia gulosa. After running through a swarm of flies, this parasite occupies your eye, and it breeds there. This case study, and the only other known instance in the literature, have occurred within 2 years of each other, and could be the beginnings of a pattern. The 68-year-old woman has demonstrated yet another reason not to travel to California. While running on a trail, she encountered the swarm of flies and swatted them away. About a month later, she found that her eye had become irritated, and that it became increasingly uncomfortable. Flushing it with water did not appear to help, but did eventually reveal a mobile round worm that was about 1.5 centimeters in length. Further washing produced a second worm. She then visited an ophthalmologist, who brought out a third worm and gave her antibiotics. For further weeks, she continued to experience discomfort in her eye back in her home state. She was told that she had conjunctivitis by her local ophthalmologist. They also could not identify any worms. Despite this, she produced a fourth worm. This compares unfavorably with the other case study that produced 14 worms from one eye. In the long term, if she had not been able to have the worms removed, it could have led to complications, not the least of which is irritation to the eye, going all the way up to blindness. In other medical news, we have an update on the world's first penis and scrotum transplant. According to reports, the veteran of the US Armed Forces is proceeding well and has not rejected the organ just yet. This occurred as a byproduct of his deployment to Afghanistan, where he was ambushed and lost his lower extremities, genitals, and part of his abdomen in 2010, unlike the other known transplant of this sort from 2006. He has been successful. The Chinese transplant was not accepted, and the graft began to become rejected, leading to necrosis. Unlike that transplant, this procedure required a far larger transplant, took much longer, and had significantly higher risks. The transplant in this case involved not only the penis and scrotum, but part of the abdominal wall. It was roughly 25 centimeters by 25 centimeters. It weighed over 2 kilograms, required 11 different surgeons and 14 hours of operation. In one of the more unexpected lines from research, he has near normal erections and the ability to achieve orgasm, as the surgeons write in their case report. It is worth noting that there were some ethical issues associated with this particular procedure, the most important of which was that although the scrotum was transplanted, the testes were not, as it could have led to them fathering children with the donor's DNA. For ethical reasons, then, these were not transplanted. The whole procedure was also coupled with the infusion of bone marrow from the donor. This helped to reduce the likelihood of rejection and complications from the transplant. This means he can use a minimum of immunosuppressing medication, with prospective future developments allowing that to be reduced even further. In a bizarre and quirky development of brain scanning investigations, researchers have found that people with autism have a more symmetrical brain, and this could have implications for both the condition and treatment. Brain scanning people with autism is not a novel thing. In fact, it's one of the easiest and most effective ways to identify autism spectrum disorders early on, in fact so early as in utero. This investigation looked at 1,700 individuals with an autism spectrum disorder and 1,800 controls. What they found was that there was considerably less difference in the brain's outer layer, known as the cortex. This reduced variability was only found when they accounted for autism as a key variable. Things like sex, medication, or IQ did not have an effect, although the overall result is small and not enough to base a diagnosis on. It could mean that there is something underlying it that plays into autism. In other brain and medicine related news, an opioid addict has had electrodes planted in their brain in order to help resolve their addiction to it. These implants, known as deep brain stimulators, have been used in other conditions such as Parkinson's disease and epilepsy, and even in some cases obsessive-compulsive disorders. It's used as a last line of treatment when medication and other therapies have failed. The 33-year-old male was part of a small pilot program which was intended to demonstrate the safety of this technique and allow it to progress to a full clinical trial. The hope is that it could be used for the small proportion of opioid addicts that are simply unable to achieve sobriety despite all of the available processes, treatments, and programs that are available to the wider public. This would make it a last line of treatment. The process should be a last line of treatment, given that not only does it involve a very invasive surgery, but what will likely be a long-term implant. This procedure requires putting a small hole in the skull, running wires into the nucleus accumbens, which provides the reward-benefit process from opioids. This small device then has what is a charge and control pack mounted under the collarbone. It then pulses power into that part of the brain as needed to modulate the reward process. The problem is they're not entirely sure how it does this and if there are going to be complications. Despite that, the underlying theory has been accepted as a sound practice. It's worked in other conditions that have similar neurological bases and should, in theory, be able to be extrapolated to this form of addiction. In other medicine-related news, the US is running short of immunoglobulin, an important medicine used to treat a wide range of conditions, perhaps most importantly epilepsy and cancer. As a result, hospitals are being forced to ration and reduce doses of this life-saving treatment. Some doctors are even being forced to cancel treatment altogether. Immunoglobulins are a product of blood donations. They are a part of the serum that is spun off from the red cells and provides an antibody supply for those who receive the transfusion. One of the major reasons why the supply is drying up is doctors are using it off-label. Off-label is when a doctor or physician prescribes a medication or treatment for something that it has not received approval. In this case, immunoglobulin therapies are being used for things like strep infections, infertility, and fungal infections. Despite not having approval and otherwise little evidence to support its use, doctors are claiming its efficacy. This means that although there has been an increase in supply both from donors and from manufacturers, there has been a greater increase in demand, which means demand exceeds supply by a significant margin. This leads to what is likely to be an ongoing and long-term shortage. According to experts, it can take between 7 and 12 months to produce and supply these medicines, and that it will take more than 1,000 plasma donations to produce a single year's supply for a single patient. Manufacturers have said that the best they can hope for at the moment, based on approvals from the FDA, is to increase production by 35% by 2021. This also ties into the fact that local donation rates are not necessarily tied in to local availability of immunoglobulins, as they are all shipped to a central processing plant, dealt with there, and then redistributed in a pattern that is not necessarily related to what has been donated in any given region. This means that although some areas may be providing a large volume of plasma, that may not be feeding back into the amount available locally. With that in mind, you may wish to consider donating plasma. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting or of use, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.